is Yaz Lancaster, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am a transdisciplinary artist currently based in Lenape-Hoking, also known today as Harlem, New York City. I'm primarily a violinist, a composer, and a poet, though I work in several other mediums, and yeah, I appreciate composers now for reaching out to me to talk about my practice for the Impact series. So I grew up listening to almost exclusively hip-hop, R&B, and rap music. I remember listening to a lot of Biggie, DMX, Mary J. Blige, Missy Elliott, Lauryn Hill, because that's the music that my parents listened to. I started playing violin around 8. I was in 3rd grade. And fun fact, I actually wanted to play the cello, but I didn't know what it was called, so I asked for a violin thinking it was a cello. And I was really shocked when the guy brought out a violin, because it was obviously much smaller than I was thinking. But I just stuck with it. I was like, okay, I guess this is what violin is. But yeah, as I got older, I started discovering other types of music. I remember getting into like pop punk, rock and indie, alternative music throughout middle school and high school. I'd probably say Nirvana was the most important find for me at that time, and still is an influence for me today. And I ended up playing violin and being in other ensembles all throughout high school. And by that time, I realized that I couldn't imagine my life without being a musician, even though I still had some other interests. But yeah, I was in high school, I was in chamber and symphony orchestras. I was conducting the younger string orchestra. I was playing bass clarinet in wind ensemble. I picked up tenor sax for pep band. And I was even traveling to marching band competitions, even though I wasn't in marching band, and DCI competitions to sort of help move gear and take photos and things like that. Just because I was so interested in the collaborative aspect of making music. Like I loved being together in a room with other people doing something, and doing the same thing and working towards the same goals. But yeah, that was my upbringing, and I ended up going to New York University for a violin performance for both my undergraduate degree and my master's degrees. So I was also writing poetry for quite a long time. The earliest poem I can remember was in middle school. I wrote a poem about rainforests and about Steve Irwin, who I think had just passed at that time. But yeah, I was interested in writing, and I sort of spontaneously decided to study poetry during my undergraduate degree at NYU. There was a study abroad program in Florence over the summer, and I ended up taking that course where I studied craft and ekphrastic writing, which is sort of writing from a different medium or a different source. So we would go to Florentine art museums and then write poems based on paintings and sculptures and things that we saw there at the museums. And I think that that whole summer and that whole program really heavily informed my practice as a writer, as well as a composer, where I've become really fascinated with the idea of sort of transmuting one medium to another by way of fragmenting. So fragments are a huge part of my compositional practice, but also my written poetry practice, and just fragmenting things in order to recontextualize them into something else. That's something that I remember becoming really interested in that around that time when I was in Florence. So the piece you just heard for solo saxophone was actually one of my first commissions, which I wrote for saxophonist-composer Keaton Garrett. And it was inspired by a painting by a Czech painter, Kupka. So just sort of coming out of that poetic practice I mentioned, where I'm interested in transmuting one medium to another, so painting to sound. So yeah, when I got to NYU, I quickly became integrated into the contemporary music scene, and I was performing and premiering a lot of new works and working with a lot of composers in the city. I also joined the steel band and became part of the sort of percussion world at that time. And I started seriously writing music around 2018, and I started with writing for percussion. I think I was really intimidated by the idea of sort of thinking through pitch content and harmony, so I was writing a lot of short pieces and exercises for non-pitch percussion or multi-setup. So a handful of my earlier pieces are for percussion. So I want to share my piece Sequoia, which is written for a flexible number of percussionists with flower pots, wood, and a live plant that is used to trigger fixed media samples of environmental field recordings that are made by the performers. So whoever performs the piece, they make their own electronic samples that are triggered throughout the piece. And I was really thinking about ways that people can engage with nature in a way that isn't destructive. And so over the course of the piece, the plant performer sort of retakes the sonic space as the human performers play less and listen more. The other percussion piece I'll share is called Disarmed, which is a percussion duo I wrote that sort of takes on the conversation surrounding gun control. I was really trying to think through the issue, and the piece sort of goes on this narrative arc of all the things that were coming up for me as I researched gun violence from a couple of different angles. So mass shootings, school shootings, police brutality, gang violence, domestic violence, and so on. And just trying to understand on some level the reason people feel like they need to own guns versus the very obvious reasons as to why they're so dangerous in this country.
For coming out and speaking your mind, but I think we got to find a compromise as a country. You know,
well, the Second Amendment is not really a compromise.
I know, but we got to be able to.
The Second Amendment. We want school safety. We want an armed police officer.
You do not want school safety.
You don't make it more safe.
You're supporting the unsafe schools.
And this whole thing where they're gonna put rocks, buckets of rocks.
You're surrounded
in classrooms as a last resort.
They are legal. They are legal officers of the law.
Politically, I'm very much interested in liberatory practices, and that definitely manifests in different ways in my artistic practice. So I do have several works that directly deal with things that are sociopolitical in nature, like Disarmed, which you just heard. But also over time, my compositional practice in general has become a sort of extension of my politics in that I write a lot of music that is open scored or leaves room for improvisation and performer agency. These next few pieces are written in more open styles. So first, Intangible Landscapes, which was my first piece, I think, that really solidifies the cellular notational style that I've worked with for the past couple of years, as well as my second string quartet, Neutral Objects. Over the past few years during the pandemic, I got really into developing a recording practice. I now work from a home studio setup and have been really drawn to creating electroacoustic music that fragments from a lot of different sources, and especially music that is more genre fluid in style. And like a lot of people, I've been turning to things that I enjoyed in my childhood, so like the hip hop and rap artists that I mentioned earlier, but now sort of like in conversation with the musicians and styles that I listen to now. Just off the top of my head, some musicians like JPEG Mafia, Charlie XCX, Tyler the Creator, MF Doom, Sophie, Lil Yachty. So these are all definitely making their way into my concert music, and I've also begun making music for other types of presentation like recorded releases and popular music. I'm going to share a string of works that sort of speak to this. The first is Wind Down 2,
which was originally written for double bass, but I ended up doing a violin version of it for my recently released debut album, which came out on April 7th with People Places Records, called Amethyst. It's definitely vaporwave inspired and mixes some improvisation with cellular notation. And then you'll hear some of my piece Prime, which I wrote during my Bang on a Can summer residency, and it pulls inspiration from hardcore music, actually, so heavy music, and features screamed vocals for the instrumentalists, which was a lot of fun to do. And lastly, you'll hear a bit of Euphoric, which is a solo steel pan piece that I wrote for percussionist Chen. Yang and I used to live together, and they're a close friend of mine who also has a background in steel pan, and we played in steel bands together. So I wanted to do a piece in a sort of oral tradition, since that's how traditional pan music is learned. So the score for this piece was created as a sort of like in-person meeting and rehearsal where we just talk through what would happen and when.
I am worth more than my labor. I am worth more than my ability to produce. I am worth more than just my time or energy.
So just to conclude with a couple of things I'm currently working on, right now I'm working on a digital opera with Opera Philadelphia called Paper Tiger, which will be premiered online this spring. It deals with sort of gender identity and gender dysphoria in 3 songs, and it's definitely like heavily pop influence. It will feature Eliza Bagg and Miss Grit, also known as Margaret Stone, on vocals, and Mary Prescott on piano. And there's a ton of electronics and processing, and a little bit of improv for all 3 of those musicians. I'm also working with one of my favorite artists, Sean Pecknold, who does incredible films and animation, who I discovered through the Fleet Foxes, who I love. And he's creating a gorgeous film for the opera with some dancers and choreographers that I'm really excited about. So I'll share just a short clip of music from that work. I also want to share a little bit of music from a developing project, Laydown, which is a post-genre duo of myself and the guitarist, producer, and composer, Andrew Noseworthy. We've done a couple of concert music style pieces, like writing works for each other, and also a miniature commissions project where we had a lot of people send in some short miniatures for either guitar, electric guitar, or violin electric guitar duo that we recorded over the past couple of years. But we're now sort of leaning into the more pop side of our collaboration, and so you'll hear a song that we made together called Shoelaces. And yeah, I'm just hoping to continue exploring these connections in my work in the future. And thank you so much for listening, and thanks again to Composers Now for this opportunity to share my work.